This is Fast Bible Teacher, a brief daily nugget of fresh Bible goodness from me, Pastor Frank Delala of the Savior Community Church in Rockland County, New York. We're looking at Philemon verses 15 through 16. Paul writes, "For this perhaps is why he was parted from you for a while, that you might have him back forever, no longer as a bondservant, but more than a bondservant, as a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord." Verse 15, I love. We actually talked a little bit about this, I think, in our first episode ever of this podcast. Paul says, possibly. He uses this word, possibly. And what he's doing is he's doing something really interesting. He's speculating about what God may have been doing in Philemon's life and in Onesimus' life all along. So we believe firmly, in accordance with the scriptures, that God's at work in our lives, that he's bringing things about for our good. And so Paul here tries to lift the curtain a little bit on that, and he says, hey, Philemon, maybe this is what God has been up to all along. And he wants him to approach this with this positive sense that God's at work in his life, and he should sort of anticipate that God is up to something good. And T. Wright points out that Paul's encouraging a similar attitude to that of Joseph, where Joseph says, as for you, this is Genesis 50, verse 20, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. Now, it's that kind of attitude that Paul wants Philemon to adopt toward Onesimus. And wouldn't it be great if we lived our lives that way? If someone's doing something evil to us and we think, you know what? God is working for good in my life, even if someone is attacking me, even if it's something just so difficult. I was dealing with somebody recently who was under a very literal attack from somebody, and it is just profound. So difficult to imagine that this thing that is meant for evil could possibly be for good. N.T. Wright likes this. N.T. Wright writes this. He says, Josephus, like Paul, held a steady belief in God's providential overruling of human sin and folly. Patience and forgiveness grow well in soil like that. And in verse 16, Paul says, no longer you'll have him back forever. And the word used for have him back is, it could be used to mean that you're paid, like you've been paid in full. It can mean to just receive something in full. So he's saying, you had him before, but now you're really receiving him. And he elaborates on that, no longer as a bondservant, but more than a bondservant, as a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you? And it says, it has the sense, you can see it in the English there. He says, especially to me, which isn't naturally followed up by how much more. It's as if he catches himself and he says, you know what? This is even a bigger deal for you than it is for me. You have stuff invested in this relationship. It's been painful in the past, and now you have him back. Now, verse 17 and 18, something incredible happens. Let's look at it briefly. He says, so if you consider me your partner, receive him as you would receive me. If he's wronged you at all or owes you anything, charge that to my account. I, Paul, write this in my own hand. I will repay it, to say nothing of you owing me, even your own self. So he does something interesting. Paul is two things here. He wants two things to be transferred. Paul wants Philemon's favor for himself, for Paul, transferred to Onesimus. And he wants Onesimus's debt transferred from Onesimus to himself. That should sound really familiar to you, because that is exactly what Jesus did for us. It's the great exchange. Our sin was counted against Jesus, so that through faith in him, the favor of God over him and all of his righteousness could be counted to us. 2 Corinthians 5:21, for our sake he made him to be sin, who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Now, Paul is applying that deal, the deal from 2 Corinthians 5, to this particular relationship. And he is doing that for a beloved friend. But we read in the scriptures that Jesus did it for his enemies. Romans 5:6-8, for while we were still weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would even dare to die. But God shows his love for us in that, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Paul is very literally and practically taking the example of Jesus and what he's done for us, and he's getting in between these two men that he loves so much, and he's saying, give my favor to him, give his debt to me. And he says, I, Paul, I'll pay it. I'm writing this letter, I will repay it. And then we'll talk about the second half of verse 19 next time. For show links and notes for my Sunday Sermon podcast, and for the big show, a frank discussion with Jan Jacobs, go to fastbibleteacher.com.